Good evening. My name is Diana Quintero. I am a master's student at Globalisation and Development Studies here at FASoS. And today we are having part of a John Monnet lecture with Philomena Apiko, who is the head of Africa-European Relations at the European Center for Development Policy Management. So Philomena, thank you so much for being here with us today. And we just have a couple of questions.
Thank you so much, Diana. It is my pleasure to be here. I've followed closely the work of the Center for European Research in Maastricht, and I'm honored to be part of the discussions today.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So we'll begin with a question that can be a little bit broad, but how do you see the relationship between Africa and the EU going forward in, let's say, the next 10 years?
Next 10 years is quite a good stretch, but I think it also allows for honest reflection on, for example, some of the commitments made between Africa and Europe during the last summit in February. As you're aware, the AU and EU leaders met last year, and there was a vast commitments that were made, stretching from issues around migration, issues around peace and security, climate change, and health, which is an emerging issue within the partnership, but a crucial one given the COVID-19 pandemic. So, what could I say, optimistically 10 years from now? Firstly, for me, I see within the partnership a move towards more trade, investment, and discussions around infrastructure development, moving beyond what we see as the donor partnership aid rhetoric. So in hopefully 10 years, we will see more investments on the continent, really sticking to what the AU priorities are. From African member states, they have clear requests and also putting forward the need industrialization, value chain addition. So for me, I would imagine that the partnership would move towards more of these discussions. And in fact, we have seen, for example, the European Global Gateway, which I'm sure a lot of people have discussed around the 150 billion mobilized for Africa, committed to some of these priorities. So we do have a focus on supporting the African continental free trade area, but also moving towards infrastructure development, which is quite key. Also, something else I think would be interesting to see is the fact that we see more African agency rising within 10 years. Already now we see some of these dynamics in the international fora. We have seen requests for reforms of the UN Security Council by Africa, asking for more representation on the UN Security Council, but also for reform of financial institutions like the World Bank. We have also seen a call for the African Union to be part of the G20, which is quite key when it comes to economic and global governance issues. So for me, 10 years from now, I would like to remain, as a young African, optimistic that we see more and more of these discussions, really the AU taking center stage in some of these global discussions. But this requires the member states, of course, go back and strategize amongst themselves what the priorities are and speak with a common voice in international fora. And what I could say from the EU side also would be interesting to see some of the developments looking beyond what a partnership beyond aid would look like. So for the EU, honestly, discussing amongst itself how they can foster more investments in Africa, investments that are tailored to what African countries need and not just, pushing EU interests at the detriment of countries. And in 10 years, I would also like, most importantly, to see more non-state actors having more voice in this partnership. It has been a challenge to incorporate and institutionalize non-state actors like civil society, private sector, youth, but also local authorities within the partnership. A lot of people feel that the commitments are made at a really high level, yet if we look at the partnership, the promise was for it to be more people-centered. So how can, even for example, academia, you sitting here at the university, how can you play a better role within this partnership, looking for solutions for the continent? These are some of my optimistic takes 10 years from now, but of course it takes one step forward. Maybe what I can mention also on the EU side to its advantage would be that within 10 years we'll see, for example, the Global Gateway implementation already underway. This will be a litmus test, I would say, for the commitment of the European Union towards more infrastructure development. We know that China has been taking up this role within the continent, and a lot of people have said that the Global Gateway is sort of like a competition with China. But I think the EU can use it to go beyond just this rhetoric of competition to really make it a long-term investment strategy that could benefit both continents.
Yeah, thank you, Philomena. These are very, very interesting because looking at 10 years, like you say, it's very we don't really know what can happen in a short term. And it's very interesting what you said about the more people-led actions that are needed. And in which areas do you think that this could actually take force in?
Definitely, when we come to business, the private sector has a key role to play. Ultimately, they're the ones who understand how business operates in different continents, and they have also the financial mechanism to leverage what government is already doing. So issues around blended support, issues around support to private sector to really take their role, in shaping some of these trade and investment discussions. I think this would be great. For civil society, apart from the role that they have in, of course, participating in the shaping of agenda, they can also play a role in monitoring some of the commitments made. I mean, if I'm to ask you, do you remember what happened during the Abidjan summit in 2017? Most people would say, well, I'm not sure, because we don't have as yet a tracking mechanism to really see whether the commitments made are adhered to. And this is where civil society playing a greater role to really hold governments to account.
And with the participation within G20, how important do you think that Africa would have such, what role would it play within? Yeah.
That's a very good question. I mean, if you look at the statistics around what the economic power of the G20, it's quite a big force. And at the moment, we only have South Africa as the only African country represented. Mm-hmm. Yet a lot of the policies, when we speak about, even during COVID-19, debt recovery, a lot of the recipient, or the countries of interest were African countries. Mm-hmm. When we speak about issues around financing for investments, these are also investments looking at that continent. Mm-hmm. So why should African countries just be recipients of policies made in their name without being active participants? So I think this is what we need to see more and more, just moving from our norm taker to a norm shaper, being involved in the setting of agenda, being involved in the implementation of some of these policies as well.
Perfect. I would think that is true, to have more countries being involved. And to move a little bit of a shift, and I know that this is more recent with recent conflicts and events that have unfolded in Sudan, and talking about policy development within migration, for example. How do you see the relationship with the European Union, especially given that, according to the United Nations, the United Nations Refugee Agency calculates about 800,000 may flee Sudan as a result of ongoing conflict, and migration policy is something that is very contentious, tricky topic.
Contentious topic,
yes.
Yeah. Within the partnership, for sure, migration has always been one of those files that people sort of circulate around. At the last summit, they tried to also link it more and more to education and skilling, but of course, the other dynamics to migration around reintegration, return, things that cause a little bit of friction when it comes to the divergences towards how solutions should be attained. But to your question on the situation in Sudan, I think for me, firstly, before we even move to Europe, I would first say the first point of call should be how to support the receiving neighboring countries. Because let's be honest, when you're fleeing to the first point of safety. So how can the EU then support those receiving countries? If you look at the neighbors of Sudan, some of them themselves are undergoing conflict. So it's a situation of how do you deal with refugees who may be secondary to this crisis in Sudan, meaning that they fled from, for example, South Sudan to Sudan, and then now the Sudan conflict is causing them to flee again. So this is some of the dynamics that I think we need to be aware of when we speak about the migration issue in Sudan. How can support be tailored towards helping those who are most vulnerable? For example, we have heard of cases of unaccompanied minors traveling by themselves without their parents. So we need to be able to have mechanisms in place to address some of these priority groups, to be able to get them over the hurdle. Because let's face it, migration comes with backlogs, administrative backlogs in most countries. And we need to see how to, of course, deal with these issues. So that would be my first situation here. But also for me, the situation in Sudan, I feel sometimes people tend to, I don't want to say overblow it, but then we need to look at who is fleeing. So we had students who were present, we had migrant workers, experts. So these people are being repatriated by their respective governments. So in essence, the outlook may be that yes, people who are fleeing, but it shouldn't be seen as an overblown situation that everybody's running away and running to Europe. And then when it comes to the situation in Europe, if and when that is a case that we see more migrants coming from Sudan into the EU, this will not, for me, it will just be in addition to what's already existing. We already have backlogs of several other refugees and asylum seekers fleeing from their countries, looking for refuge in Europe. What I think needs to be addressed is how to have a long-term solution to the migration problem. Within the EU, this is the competence of member states, and are member states themselves willing to, first of all, receive refugees? And even when refugees are within the EU borders, how can they have agreements to maybe divide, for relocation purposes? But then it also, for me, questions what are some of the legal pathways that could, for example, be explored in this situation of Sudan? Could we, for example, already be discussing the possibility of family reunification being used? There are Sudanese present in the EU diaspora. Can they be, for example, allowed to take in some people on a temporary basis who are fleeing from the situation? This is some of the legal pathways that I would like to see discussed, less, just making it seem like,
More.
And of course, support to the receiving countries within the neighborhood of Sudan.
Yeah, very, very interesting point of view, Philomena. Thank you very much. So I want to thank you for your time, and thank you so much.
No, it's been an honor, and we're looking forward to collaborating more with Sarah, and all the best as well with the finalization of your thesis.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.